Hi, I'm Dan Hylton, Research Manager with HousingLink, and welcome to this webinar on Housing Choice Voucher data and trends. HousingLink is a Minneapolis-based nonprofit with a mission of improving people's lives through information expanding their affordable rental choices. Now, if you're watching this webinar, chances are you are an affordable housing professional or enthusiast and have at least a basic understanding of what housing choice vouchers are. So a lot of what I say is based on that assumption, but just very briefly, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, you'll commonly hear it referred to as Section 8, is a federal government program in which families are able to, in theory, use a voucher to obtain rental housing in the private market. That is to say, they're not limited to choosing between specific publicly subsidized housing properties. The way that works is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development provides funding to local public housing agencies or housing authorities to administer the vouchers locally. A family that is issued a voucher is then responsible for finding their own housing, and an owner must agree to accept the voucher. More on that later. And then once living there, the HA, the housing authority, will provide a subsidy covering a portion of the rent directly to the landlord on behalf of the family with the voucher, and then the family will then pay the remainder of the rent. Now I will tie the Housing Choice Voucher Program with some of what we do here at HousingLink. One of the primary ways we serve the community is with a housing search rental tool. Landlords can post vacancies on our site and renters can search for a place to live. Anyone searching for housing on our site can indicate that they have a voucher and return in their search only vacancies that have indicated that they are willing to house those with vouchers. 84% of landlords who post vacancies on housinglink.org indicate a willingness to accept a voucher. And that's a pretty big deal. We know it's one thing to get a voucher. Most of the Housing Choice Voucher waiting lists in town are closed. And even once on the waiting list, a family might well wait years before actually being issued a voucher. But once a voucher is issued, comes a whole new challenge, which is being able to actually use the voucher in the private market. When the voucher program began as an experimental pilot in 1970, it was done so with the express intent of providing low-income families with allowances to assist them in obtaining existing decent rental housing of their choice. And while what that means exactly isn't specifically defined, there's always been the hope that given our nation's history of economic and racial segregation, the use of vouchers in the private market would help integrate communities by opening up opportunities in neighborhoods that had traditionally not been available to low-income families, whether purely due to the cost of private market housing or just because subsidized housing investment has traditionally been concentrated in lower income, racially segregated neighborhoods. But here we are over 50 years since that initial demonstration project, and we're finding that voucher holder families are using their vouchers in areas of higher poverty at rates far exceeding the general population. So why is this happening? Well, we know that there's a body of evidence showing the connection between the poverty level of a neighborhood a family lives in and everything from social and emotional well-being of children to future earning potential. But at the same time, many voucher holders choose to live in higher poverty neighborhoods for reasons having to do with a desire to be close to relatives or have better access to their childcare or job. Unfortunately, there's not great data out there on the actual motivations behind where voucher holders ultimately choose to use their vouchers, or if there is, I'm not aware of it. But we know our main concern just has to be that that choice of where to use the voucher is not constrained. And there's really two ways that voucher use can be constrained. So forgive me on the age of date in these next few slides, but in 2010, we partnered with an organization called Homeline to study voucher use in the Twin Cities Metro. If someone wants to fund us to take another crack at this, we'd love to see how things have changed. But in the meantime, we're looking at 2010 data. Anyway, the first way voucher use can be constrained is for rents to simply not be below the payment standard amount for a given jurisdiction. And by payment standard, I mean simply the maximum monthly rent a housing authority will agree to subsidize. Those payment standards are set based on bedrooms in a unit and somewhat on where the housing is located. More on that later. So in this study, we call this first barrier to overcome accessibility. You have potential access to the unit if the rent falls below the payment standard, and you do not have access to the unit if the rent is above the payment standard. So in this particular study, we looked at rental vacancies in 61 Twin Cities metro communities to see the percent of those rents that fall below voucher payment standards. As you can see, in only 30% of the communities did all the rents we look at fall below the payment standards. And in 15% of the communities, that's on the left side of this graph, less than half the rents were below the standards. That's more than half the available vacancies that are unavailable to a voucher holder before they can even get a chance to make a call to a landlord or put in an application. This becomes a particular concern in larger jurisdictions that don't have granularity in payment standards to account for submarkets with higher rents. It can lead to voucher holders being effectively priced out of certain neighborhoods. And then, even if a rent does qualify under the payment standard, the voucher still has to be accepted by a landlord. So as part of that same study, we placed calls to landlords to see if a voucher would be accepted in their rental units. And you'll never guess what the percent was that said yes, that they would accept a voucher. That's right, 20% said yes, they would accept a voucher. Now, this was back in 2010. However, HUD conducted a study in multiple markets in 2018 and found that if there were no statutory requirements to accept a voucher, that acceptance rate was around 24%, so pretty close. You see, in most jurisdictions in the country, landlords are not obligated to recognize housing choice vouchers as source of income, which would be protected under fair housing law. So once a renter finds a vacant unit, and vacancy rates have been really low for the past decade plus, when they find a vacant unit that falls under the payment standard, they're still faced with the likelihood that their voucher won't even be accepted. So a voucher holder is looking for a place to live. But when you combine the dual barriers of accessibility, that is, rents fall under the payment standards, along with landlord acceptance, it's just not easy to use those vouchers. So what to do? Well, that project we did in 2010 was done to demonstrate the potential impact of adopting small area FMRs. That is to say, payment standards with a basis on fair market rents, FMR, established at a zip code level rather than a county level. This better accounts for what I was saying before, the potentially wide range of affordability between different submarkets. In that study, we found that there would be an increase of 8% in qualifying rents, the rents that are accessible were fair market rents to be adopted throughout the entire Twin Cities metro, at least back in 2010. Now, our largest suburban housing authority in the Twin Cities just adopted a small market FMR approach to establishing rents. So that's great. Obviously, a landlord still has to accept the voucher, but this approach, at least in many instances, mitigates at least one traditional barrier to placing a voucher. It just opens up potential access to a greater supply of units. But that other barrier, the barrier of landlord acceptance, remains. Now, HousingLink is engaged specifically in work with a goal to increase the number of owners and managers accepting rental assistance programs, including housing choice vouchers. This includes producing landlord-specific rental information, rental assistance information kit, which is available on our website, along with a myth-busting video housing authorities can use to promote landlord-focused customer service improvements and the benefits of accepting rental assistance. But in addition, HousingLink is doing direct outreach to landlords to educate them on the process of accepting rental assistance and encouraging more landlords to say yes to accepting vouchers. As part of that collaboration with local housing authorities, many of the agencies have provided HousingLink with data to establish a baseline on where vouchers are being used and where there are opportunities to increase acceptance. An earlier chart showed the percent of vouchers being used in high poverty census tracts as opposed to the percent of the overall population living in high poverty tracts. Here's that same data broken out by Minneapolis and St. Paul, the core cities, versus the suburbs in the Twin Cities. We aren't getting data from every jurisdiction yet, but for those that we do, we could actually break this down to a much more granular geography, but are trying to err on the side of discretion when representing where vouchers are being used publicly. But the ability to see comparative geographies and specific voucher placement allows us to establish a baseline of voucher use and develop strategies for increasing acceptance in underrepresented areas. Here, certainly you see that voucher use rates are much higher in high poverty areas, whether you're talking in the core cities or in the suburbs. Here we see some more analysis we gleaned from housing authority data. We're looking at the total number of vouchers in use versus the total number of unique owners. So to get to unique owner, we just literally aggregated to owner's name in the data. I did personally take some time to look through the data, try to identify where the owner names might have been spelled inconsistently and so on, but ultimately this finding is only as good as the data. But be that as it may, the finding here appears pretty stark that in the core cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, a fewer number of owners house a much larger number of vouchers. We don't know the reason for sure. I can imagine some particularly large complexes in the core cities where vouchers are accepted, say Riverside Plaza, that might skew these figures a bit. But I just think there's more older Class C development in those cities, the sorts of properties that are a little older with fewer amenities. And those types of properties are generally more open to accepting vouchers. So with comparatively fewer apartment complexes accepting vouchers in the suburbs, the voucher system is more dependent on what we call the shadow market of single family, duplex, condo, and townhome rentals where the landlord or owner is managing fewer units. We see this in our own vacancy postings to HousingLink.org. When looking only at vacancies that have indicated a willingness to accept Section 8, shadow market vacancies compose a roughly similar percent of the market in both the core cities and the suburbs. Just a little more shadow market in the suburbs. But when looking at other listings, those that did not indicate that they were willing to accept Section 8, which we see on the right side of this graph, we see a pretty significant skew away from shadow market. That is a larger percentage of multifamily in the suburbs. So basically what this is indicating, at least in our data, is that the shadow market in the suburbs is bearing an outsized share of the housing opportunities for those with vouchers. And again, that is supported by the ratio of owner units to owner chart that we saw on the previous slide. And I'll show that again. Fewer units per owner in the suburbs. Again, this is the data that we have at an individual jurisdiction level, and we do have it even at an individual voucher level. We're still in that strategy phase of planning outreach and trying to increase acceptance rates. Looking at listings that have indicated a willingness to accept a voucher in HousingLink's search tool is actually really helpful for analysis. As I mentioned earlier, an inordinately high percentage, 84% of landlords who post a vacancy to our website are willing to accept a voucher, which is simply not representative of the overall market. In 2018, HUD did a pilot study of voucher acceptance, and in 3 markets where voucher discrimination was not prohibited, there was an overall acceptance rate of 24%. So HousingLink gets a high percentage of what you call friendlies, but directionally, we will see broader market trends reflected in our own data. If voucher acceptance is up, we'll see our already high acceptance rate tick up a bit. So what do we see in acceptance rates for landlords who post vacancies on HousingLink? Well, here we're looking at fourth quarter year over year for the past 3 years for the 3 largest housing authorities in the metro. As you can see, there's been a consistent increase in percent of landlords willing to accept a Section 8 voucher. Without talking to landlords specifically about their motivations, we can only speculate. We do know that rents have stabilized somewhat in the past year plus, and we'll often find that if demand softens, we'll see a little more acceptance for vouchers. It just stands to reason that you can't afford to be as, we'll say, discriminating, literally, when you need to fill a unit. It's also possible that we're seeing a byproduct of the pandemic. As a result of pandemic-related job loss, which we know hit renter households harder than homeowner households, some folks are unable to pay their rent. Ordinarily, the vast majority of evictions are as a result of non-payment of rent, but given a series of statewide eviction moratoria, landlords are left without that recourse. So given the financial strain that landlords are feeling in this environment, it would not be surprising were they to be a little more open to accepting a voucher, since that could simply represent to them a guaranteed rent payment. And in fact, last fall, HousingLink partnered with Family Housing Fund on a survey of landlord experience during the pandemic, and 3% of respondents said that if additional financial assistance was not forthcoming, acceptance of vouchers would be among the changes in their business model that they would consider. And finally, Minneapolis passed an anti-voucher discrimination ordinance way back in 2017, the first of its kind in Minnesota. It was tied up in appeals in the court system until last summer, when a series of rulings, first by the Minnesota Court of Appeals and then upheld by the Minnesota Supreme Court, allowed the city to enforce the ordinance. So at present, that is the rule of law now in Minneapolis. And looking at Minneapolis compared to the other two housing jurisdictions in our chart, you can see they all have an increase from fourth quarter 2019 to fourth quarter 2020. But here you see a likely direct influence of the ordinance, with the change in Minneapolis acceptance rate far outdistancing the other two. And we can break that timing down even further and see that right here, June into July of 2020 in Minneapolis, where there's an 11-point bump, right around that time where we saw the court rulings come in. But let's not lose sight of the overall trend, which is that of higher acceptance rates over the past couple of years throughout the metro. Again, data drawn from vacancies landlords post to the HousingLink website are not representative necessarily of the overall market, but directionally, it certainly is an encouraging trend for those trying to use vouchers. So a quick recap of the overall trends I covered in this presentation. We know that voucher holders live in higher poverty areas at rates exceeding that of the general low-income population. We know that there are two things constraining voucher use: both rents that exceed the payment standard amounts and landlord willingness to accept vouchers. There seems to be proportionally less opportunity for voucher holders to live in larger multifamily buildings in the suburbs, where the system is a little more dependent on the shadow market. And we have seen voucher use tick up over the past couple of years. And that is all I have for you today. As I said at the top, I'm Dan Hylton. I'm the research manager at HousingLink. I invite you to visit our website and check out the various offerings we have in research related to rental housing in Minnesota, from reports on median rents to subsidized housing supply to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the rental housing market. You can sign up for updates from HousingLink data and research, and you can let me know if you have questions about the data in today's presentation or any of our other resources. Thanks.